Look up at the night sky. Somewhere beyond the darkness, almost 1 billion miles away, Saturn is moving through space. Today, there is nothing mysterious about what we call it. Saturn is a planet. We know its size. We know its rings. We know its orbit. We know that it takes almost 30 years to travel once around the Sun. But thousands of years ago, nobody had a telescope powerful enough to see Saturn's rings. Nobody had spacecraft. Nobody knew that Saturn was surrounded by ice and rock. And yet, ancient astronomers knew something remarkable about it. They knew Saturn moved. Slowly. Very slowly. Against the background of stars that appeared fixed in the heavens, Saturn wandered. And because it wandered, ancient civilizations placed it in a completely different category from the ordinary stars. In Mesopotamia, Saturn was observed, recorded, named, and associated with the divine world. But then we encounter an ancient text that describes the heavens in an even stranger way. The Book of Enoch. Enoch doesn't use the modern language of planets, galaxies, or solar systems. Instead, he speaks about luminaries. Stars. Gates in heaven. Appointed courses. And heavenly bodies that are expected to remain within a specific order. Then, in one of his most mysterious visions, Enoch sees 7 stars that have been imprisoned because they transgressed the command of God. 7 stars. Bound in darkness. So what were they? Could they have been ancient planets? Could Saturn have been one of them? Or are we looking at something completely different? Because there's a problem. The Book of Enoch never actually calls Saturn, Saturn. And it never literally says. Saturn is not a planet. So why would anyone make that claim? And what did the ancient world actually believe Saturn was? That's what we're going to investigate. And if you're new to the 9th tablet, subscribe now. Because we're not going to force an ancient text to say something it doesn't say. We're going to go back to Enoch. Look at the strange heavenly beings he describes. Compare them with the astronomy of the ancient world. And see how far the evidence actually takes us. And stay with me, because by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the word star meant something. Imagine standing beneath the night sky thousands of years ago. There are no telescopes. No satellites. No computer screens showing the positions of planets. Just your eyes. And the heavens. At first, the sky seemed perfectly still. Thousands of stars appear fixed in their familiar patterns. But then you notice something strange. One of those lights doesn't stay where it should. Night after night, it slowly changes position. It moves against the background stars. And unlike the ordinary stars, it wanders. This is where the ancient world discovered something that would shape astronomy for thousands of years. There were heavenly lights that didn't behave like the fixed stars. The Greeks eventually called these wandering bodies planetae, meaning wanderers. And among the visible wanderers were Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Add the Sun and Moon. And ancient observers had a group of 7 major celestial bodies that could be seen moving through the heavens. Saturn was the slowest and most distant of the planets visible to the naked eye. Its movement was so slow that an ancient observer could watch the heavens for weeks and barely notice the change. But over longer periods, the movement became unmistakable. Saturn was wandering. And ancient civilizations didn't simply observe these bodies. They watched them carefully. They recorded their appearances. They tracked their movements. And they gave them meaning. In ancient Mesopotamia, celestial observation became deeply connected with the interpretation of signs. The sky wasn't merely something above humanity. It was something that could be read. And this is where the Book of Enoch becomes fascinating. Because Enoch also describes a highly ordered heaven. But instead of giving us a modern list of planets, he describes luminaries and stars following appointed courses. The sun has its path. The moon has its path. The stars have their appointed places. The seasons occur according to an established order. And when something moves outside that order, it's not treated as an insignificant astronomical event. It becomes a sign that something has gone wrong. Now think about those 7 stars Enoch later describes. 7 celestial lights. Bound because they transgressed their appointed order. If they represent the ancient planets, then Saturn becomes an obvious candidate because Saturn was one of the 7 major wandering bodies known to ancient observers. But here's where we have to slow down. That's an interpretation, not something Enoch explicitly tells us. And there's another possibility. Those 7 stars could refer to the Pleiades, the famous star cluster that has been interpreted in connection with Enoch's 7 imprisoned stars. So we're left with a genuine ancient mystery. 7 stars. 7 wandering lights. And a text obsessed with the idea that every heavenly body has an appointed place. But here's the question that changes everything. Why would Enoch describe these heavenly lights as being imprisoned in the first place? Were they actually planets? Were they celestial beings? Or was Enoch describing something that the modern categories of planet and star simply can't capture? Because when we reach the next part of the story, Enoch takes us somewhere completely different. He doesn't just show us the stars. He shows us their prison. Now we come to one of the strangest visions in the entire Book of Enoch. Enoch is taken to a desolate region. A place surrounded by mountains and darkness. And then he sees something that doesn't make sense. 7 stars. But these aren't ordinary stars scattered across the night sky. Enoch describes them as enormous, burning objects. And they're bound. They have been imprisoned. Why? Because, according to the vision, they transgressed the command of the Lord. They crossed a boundary. They failed to remain within their appointed order. And now they are being held in a place of punishment. Think about how strange that image is. If these were simply stars in the modern scientific sense, why would Enoch describe them as criminals? Why would they be capable of transgression? Why would they need to be imprisoned? This is where the interpretation becomes fascinating. One possibility is that Enoch is describing celestial beings using the imagery of stars. That's not unusual in ancient religious literature. Stars could symbolize heavenly beings, rulers, or supernatural powers. But another interpretation connects these 7 stars with the 7 wandering heavenly bodies known to ancient observers. The Sun. The Moon. Mercury. Venus. Mars. Jupiter. And Saturn. If that's the case, Saturn suddenly becomes extremely interesting. Because Saturn was one of the 7 visible wanderers of the ancient sky. And unlike the fixed stars, it actually moved. But we need to be honest about something. Enoch never tells us, these 7 stars are the 7 planets. And he certainly doesn't say, the 7th one is Saturn. That's a conclusion later interpreters might draw from the ancient astronomical context. There's another possibility too. Some scholars connect the 7 stars with the Pleiades, a famous cluster of stars that appears prominently in ancient traditions. So we have 2 competing possibilities. Planets. Or a group of actual stars. And neither interpretation should be presented as absolute fact. But there's something both possibilities have in common. They bring us back to the same idea that dominates Enoch's astronomical vision. Heaven has an order. The stars have appointed places. The luminaries have appointed courses. And when something crosses the boundary assigned to it, judgment follows. That idea becomes even more important when we look at the ancient understanding of Saturn. Because Saturn wasn't simply another bright object in the sky. It had a name, a history, and a divine identity. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. Because if Saturn was already known to ancient astronomers, why doesn't Enoch call it Saturn? Why does he use words like star and luminary instead? The answer takes us into an ancient world where astronomy and spirituality weren't separated the way they are today. And that's where we're going next. To understand why Enoch uses the word star, we have to stop thinking like modern astronomers for a moment. Today, the word star has a very specific scientific meaning. A star is a massive sphere of plasma producing its own energy through nuclear fusion. Saturn obviously isn't a star. It's a planet. But Enoch wasn't writing with a modern scientific vocabulary. He was describing what he saw from the perspective of an ancient observer. And from the ground, Saturn looks like a point of light in the night sky. So does Jupiter. So does Mars. So does Venus. They look like stars. The difference is that these particular lights wander against the background stars. And that is why ancient cultures developed special categories for these wandering bodies. They weren't ordinary fixed stars. They were wanderers. In ancient Mesopotamia, these wandering heavenly bodies were carefully observed and recorded. Saturn was known by the Akkadian name Kyamanu, and it occupied a significant place within Mesopotamian astral traditions. The ancient observer wasn't asking the same question we ask today. We ask, what is Saturn made of? They asked, what does Saturn's movement mean? And that difference is crucial. Because ancient astronomy wasn't always separated from religion. The heavens could be observed scientifically, while simultaneously being interpreted religiously. A celestial event could be both an astronomical occurrence and a sign. Saturn's slow movement made it particularly distinctive. It takes approximately 29.5 years to complete one orbit around the Sun. Imagine trying to understand that movement without modern instruments. You wouldn't watch Saturn complete its journey. You would watch it slowly change position across generations. And yet ancient astronomers were capable of tracking these movements with remarkable sophistication. That's why the Enochic description of an ordered heaven shouldn't immediately be turned into a modern astronomy textbook. Enoch isn't explaining Saturn's rings. He's describing a universe governed by appointed courses. The sun has its course. The moon has its course. The stars have their courses. And the heavenly bodies exist within an order established by God. This gives us a much more interesting interpretation of the mysterious 7 stars. Maybe the question isn't, was Saturn secretly not a planet? Maybe the question is, why did the ancient world classify Saturn as a star-like wandering light within a divinely ordered heaven? And once you ask that question, the Enochic text begins to make much more sense. But there's still something missing. If ancient astronomers knew Saturn was a wandering body, why would Enoch's vision describe certain heavenly lights as actually being imprisoned? That's not ordinary astronomy. And the answer may tell us more about what Enoch believed the stars themselves represented. Because in the next act, we're going to look at the ancient connection between heavenly bodies, divine beings, and judgment. There is a reason the 7 stars in Enoch's vision are so difficult to understand. The ancient writer isn't simply describing objects in space. He's describing a cosmic order in which heaven, angels, stars, and judgment are connected. Throughout the ancient world, people often looked at the heavens and saw more than physical objects. The sky was a calendar. It was a clock. And, in many traditions, it was also a realm filled with divine signs. This is especially important when we return to Enoch's 7 imprisoned stars. They aren't simply sitting in the sky. They have transgressed. They have violated an appointed order. And because of that, they are being held for judgment. That language sounds much more like the treatment of rebellious heavenly beings than the description of ordinary astronomical objects. And this creates a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the 7 stars aren't meant to be understood as planets at all. Perhaps they represent heavenly beings whose actions are being described through celestial imagery. Remember, the Book of Enoch is filled with stories about heavenly beings who cross boundaries. The Watchers descend to earth. They abandon their appointed place. They reveal forbidden knowledge. They corrupt humanity. And eventually, they are judged. The 7 stars in chapter 18 are different from the Watcher's story, but they exist within the same broader Enochic worldview. Heaven has laws. Heavenly beings have boundaries. And even the inhabitants of heaven are accountable to the Creator. That may be why the imagery of imprisonment is so powerful. The stars aren't gods. They aren't independent powers. They aren't free to create their own order. They remain beneath divine authority. And that brings us back to Saturn. If Saturn was one of the ancient world's 7 wandering heavenly bodies, then perhaps its importance isn't that it was secretly something other than a planet. Perhaps the real mystery is that the ancient world saw its movement as part of a much larger cosmic system. A system where every light in the heavens had an appointed place. And when something departed from that place, it wasn't merely moving. It was breaking the order. And here's where I want you to stay with me. Because there's one ancient detail about Saturn that makes this even more fascinating. Saturn was the slowest of the visible wandering planets. And that extraordinary slowness gave it a very different place in ancient astronomy and mythology. So what did the ancient world actually call Saturn? Why was it associated with a particular divine figure? And why did its slow journey through the heavens matter so much? That's where we're going next. Among the planets visible to the naked eye, Saturn has always been different. Not because it is invisible. Not because ancient people didn't know it existed. But because of how slowly it moves. Saturn takes roughly 29.5 years to complete one orbit around the Sun. To us, that number is simply an astronomical fact. But imagine trying to understand that movement thousands of years ago. You look into the sky tonight. And Saturn appears in one position. You look again weeks later. And it has shifted. Months pass. The change becomes clearer. Years pass. And the pattern becomes undeniable. Saturn is wandering through the heavens. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomers carefully tracked these movements, and Saturn was known by the Akkadian name Kyamanu. It was also connected with the god Ninurta in Mesopotamian astral tradition. This is where astronomy and religion become difficult to separate. For the ancient observer, Saturn wasn't merely a ball of rock and gas. It was a heavenly sign. Its movement could be observed mathematically. But its meaning could be interpreted religiously. And this is important when we return to Enoch. The Book of Enoch repeatedly emphasizes that the heavens operate according to an appointed order. The sun has its course. The moon has its course. The stars have their courses. The seasons have their appointed times. Nothing is supposed to wander randomly. Everything has a place. And Saturn's extraordinary slowness makes that concept especially fascinating. Because Saturn appears almost motionless compared with the other wandering planets. It moves so slowly that an individual human life captures only a fraction of its journey. One generation watches it move. Another generation continues the observation. And eventually, the pattern becomes part of humanity's understanding of the heavens. But Enoch's concern isn't simply with identifying these wandering lights. He's concerned with something deeper. Order. Who established the order? Who maintains it? And what happens when heavenly beings, or heavenly bodies represented as beings, break it? That question runs through the Enochic writings. And it brings us back to the 7 imprisoned stars. Because if those stars are connected with the wandering heavenly bodies, then their imprisonment isn't really a story about astronomy. It's a story about authority. Even the heavens have boundaries. Even the greatest powers in creation are not above the Creator. And that may be one of the most important ideas hidden inside Enoch's strange astronomical imagery. If you're still watching, you're probably noticing something important. This isn't really a story about Saturn alone. It's a story about how the ancient world understood the entire heavens. So if you're enjoying this investigation, subscribe to the 9th tablet. And tell me in the comments. Do you think Enoch's 7 imprisoned stars represent actual celestial bodies, heavenly beings, or something else entirely? Because the final part of this investigation brings all of these clues together. And that's where we'll answer the question we started with: what did Saturn actually represent in Enoch's world? Among the planets visible to the naked eye, Saturn has always been different. Not because it is invisible. Not because ancient people didn't know it existed. But because of how slowly it moves. Saturn takes roughly 29.5 years to complete one orbit around the Sun. To us, that number is simply an astronomical fact. But imagine trying to understand that movement thousands of years ago. You look into the sky tonight. And Saturn appears in one position. You look again weeks later. And it has shifted. Months pass. The change becomes clearer. Years pass. And the pattern becomes undeniable. Saturn is wandering through the heavens. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomers carefully tracked these movements, and Saturn was known by the Akkadian name Kyamanu. It was also connected with the god Ninurta in Mesopotamian astral tradition. This is where astronomy and religion become difficult to separate. For the ancient observer, Saturn wasn't merely a ball of rock and gas. It was a heavenly sign. Its movement could be observed mathematically. But its meaning could be interpreted religiously. And this is important when we return to Enoch. The Book of Enoch repeatedly emphasizes that the heavens operate according to an appointed order. The sun has its course. The moon has its course. The stars have their courses. The seasons have their appointed times. Nothing is supposed to wander randomly. Everything has a place. And Saturn's extraordinary slowness makes that concept especially fascinating. Because Saturn appears almost motionless compared with the other wandering planets. It moves so slowly that an individual human life captures only a fraction of its journey. One generation watches it move. Another generation continues the observation. And eventually, the pattern becomes part of humanity's understanding of the heavens. But Enoch's concern isn't simply with identifying these wandering lights. He's concerned with something deeper. Order. Who established the order? Who maintains it? And what happens when heavenly beings, or heavenly bodies represented as beings, break it? That question runs through the Enochic writings. And it brings us back to the 7 imprisoned stars. Because if those stars are connected with the wandering heavenly bodies, then their imprisonment isn't really a story about astronomy. It's a story about authority. Even the heavens have boundaries. Even the greatest powers in creation are not above the Creator. And that may be one of the most important ideas hidden inside Enoch's strange astronomical imagery. If you're still watching, you're probably noticing something important. This isn't really a story about Saturn alone. It's a story about how the ancient world understood the entire heavens. So if you're enjoying this investigation, subscribe to the 9th tablet. And tell me in the comments. Do you think Enoch's 7 imprisoned stars represent actual celestial bodies, heavenly beings, or something else entirely? Because the final part of this investigation brings all of these clues together. And that's where we'll answer the question we started with: what did Saturn actually represent in Enoch's world? Now we can finally see why the ancient description of Saturn matters. Not because Saturn is secretly something other than a planet. But because Saturn represents something the ancient world watched carefully: the movement and order of the heavens. In the Book of Enoch, the heavens are not presented as random. The sun has its appointed course. The moon has its appointed course. The stars have their appointed courses. The seasons arrive according to their appointed times. Everything has a place. And then Enoch describes a future moment when that order begins to fail. In chapter 80, the years are shortened. The seasons become disordered. The natural world stops producing things at their proper times. And the moon itself is described as changing its order and failing to appear at its appointed time. Then Enoch says something even more disturbing. The stars will err from their courses. Think about what that means within Enoch's worldview. The problem isn't simply that one planet moves differently. The problem is that the heavenly order itself is being disrupted. And that's why the 7 imprisoned stars matter. Whether those 7 stars represent planets, the Pleiades, or celestial beings remains debated. But Enoch's message remains remarkably consistent. Creation has an order. And that order belongs to God. Humanity may look at the heavens and think we're simply observing distant objects. But Enoch sees something deeper. He sees laws, boundaries, appointed times, and consequences when those boundaries are violated. So when we look at Saturn today, we shouldn't pretend that Enoch secretly described its rings or somehow knew modern planetary science. That's not what the text says. But we can ask a much more fascinating question. Why did ancient people look at the same sky we see today and understand it as a carefully ordered system filled with meaning? Why did Saturn become one of the most carefully observed wanderers in the ancient heavens? Why did Enoch describe stars as having appointed courses? And why did he portray the violation of that order as something worthy of judgment? Maybe the real mystery isn't what Saturn is. Maybe it's what the ancient sky meant. Because once you understand that, you begin to see the Book of Enoch differently. It wasn't written by people who had no interest in the heavens. They watched them. They measured them. They recorded them. And they built entire calendars around them. But Enoch takes that observation one step further. He asks, who gave the heavens their order in the first place? And according to Enoch, the answer is not Saturn. Not the stars. Not the moon. Not the sun. The heavens themselves are subject to the Creator. And if you thought the mystery of Saturn was strange, there's another Enochic mystery that takes this even further. Because Enoch doesn't only describe stars that violate their appointed courses. He describes heavenly beings who crossed their appointed boundaries. And reveals what happened to them afterward. Who were these beings? Why were they imprisoned? And what did they teach humanity before their judgment? That's the next investigation here on the 9th tablet. So if you've enjoyed this one, subscribe, and click the next video on screen. Because we're going deeper into the ancient story of the Watchers. And this time, we're following the trail from the heavens. All the way down to Earth. Keep searching. Keep questioning. And let the ancient text speak.